19-year-old Wren Calloway cut through a deliberate double seam in her grandmother's unfinished quilt and pulled out a property deed wrapped in waxed cloth. She had returned to the old sewing shop for one reason: sell what remained, before a 4,860 bank payment came due in 12 days. But the deed changed the question. The next morning, county records showed the document appeared authentic. The land had never been formally transferred out of her family, and the parcel now sat inside a booming commercial district. A property attorney gave Wren the scale of it: several $1 million. Then the records changed something deeper. Lenora had not simply held on to forgotten land. For decades, she had paid its taxes, rejected offers, and protected it even while living with very little herself. Wren returned to the quilt. There was another hidden pocket. Inside was Lenora's letter, including a warning. Do not trust anyone who abandoned you when you needed them most. 2 mornings later, after years of silence, Wren's Aunt Margot called. This was the same relative who had refused to take Wren in after her parents died. Now Margot was claiming a family interest in the property, and her attorney's son was preparing legal action that could freeze it for months. The hidden deed was real. Lenora had spent decades protecting it. So how had the one relative who walked away learned that the land was suddenly worth fighting for? On a cold November morning in Seattle at exactly 10:17, Wren Calloway's life fell apart with the quiet ping of an email. She was 19 years old, sitting beneath the harsh white lights of a glass-walled corporate office, where she worked as an administrative assistant, the youngest person on the floor by at least a decade. The words appeared on her screen without warning. Your position has been eliminated, effective immediately. For several seconds, Wren forgot how to breathe. Her fingers hovered above the as though the next keystroke might undo what she had just read. Around her, nothing changed. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. People hurried toward conference rooms, carrying expensive coffee and talking about quarterly reports. Not one of them noticed that the girl at the corner desk had just lost the only thing keeping her life from collapsing. Wren read the email again, then a third time. The words did not change. She closed her laptop slowly, picked up the small cardboard box the HR coordinator had already placed beside her chair, and walked out of the building without saying goodbye to anyone. No one stopped her. No one called her name. The security guard at the lobby desk glanced up, then returned to his phone. Wren had worked in this building for nearly 2 years, arriving early, staying late, learning every system they asked her to learn, and now she was walking through the lobby for the last time. And the only person who noticed was a man paid to watch people come and go. Outside, the Seattle rain hit her face like a slap. Wren stood on the sidewalk, clutching the box against her chest, and tried to calculate how quickly everything could disappear. Her savings account held just enough to cover 5, maybe 6 weeks of rent. Her health insurance would terminate at the end of the month, and the bank had already sent 2 warning letters about the loan she had taken out 9 months earlier. A desperate decision she made when the furnace in her apartment broke during the coldest week of January, and she had no one to call for help. The next payment was due in 12 days, $4,860. If she missed it, the bank would begin proceedings against the only asset attached to the loan. A small, forgotten sewing shop in a coastal town 2 hours south of Seattle, the last thing on earth that still connected Wren Calloway to the woman who had raised her. Wren had not always been alone. There had been a time when her world felt safe, when bedtime meant her mother's voice reading stories and mornings meant her father's laughter echoing from the kitchen. But that world ended on a rainy afternoon when Wren was 7 years old. Her parents were driving home from a hospital appointment that Wren would not understand until years later. Her mother had been sick, not the kind of sick that gets better with rest and soup. The kind that arrives quietly, takes root deep inside the body, and never leaves. Her father was behind the wheel. Her mother was resting in the passenger seat. The roads were wet. A truck crossed the center line. And just like that, Wren became a child with no parents. After the funeral, there had been exactly one conversation about who would take care of her. Wren's Aunt Margot, her mother's younger sister, was contacted by the social worker handling The case. Margot lived in a nice house in a nice neighborhood with her teenage son, Derek, and every reasonable person assumed she would step forward. She did not. Wren was standing behind a half-open door when she heard Margot's voice on the phone, clear and unhesitating. The child would be better off with someone who actually wants her. Wren was 7. She understood every word. She never forgot them. They settled into the deepest part of her memory and stayed there hard and sharp, the way a splinter stays beneath the skin long after the wound appears to heal. It was her grandmother who came. Lenora Calloway arrived at the social services office the next morning, wearing a simple cotton dress and carrying a canvas bag. She was 63 years old, stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, and ran a tiny sewing shop in a coastal town where most people paid late, and some never paid at all. She had no savings to speak of, no second income, no husband waiting at home. But she signed every document they placed in front of her without hesitation. Then she knelt in front of Wren, took both of her small hands in hers, and said 5 words that Wren would carry for the rest of her life. "You are coming home with me." Home was the sewing shop, a narrow storefront on a quiet street where the air always smelled like warm fabric, lavender hand cream, and fresh coffee. Lenora's antique sewing machine sat near the window, positioned to catch the morning light, and Wren grew up to the rhythm of that machine. The soft clatter of the needle, the whisper of thread pulling through cotton, the occasional hum of a song Lenora never quite finished. Wren used to sit cross-legged on the floor beside her grandmother's chair, sorting buttons by color while Lenora guided fabric beneath the needle with patient, steady hands. She repaired winter coats for fishermen who came in smelling of salt water and diesel fuel. She hemmed dresses for women who could not afford new ones and never made them feel small for asking. She altered wedding gowns and patched children's school uniforms and stitched torn curtains and mended work gloves and never once turned anyone away because they could not pay the full price. Wren used to think her grandmother could fix anything: a torn sleeve, a missing button, a broken heart. But Lenora could not fix what time eventually demands. 2 years ago, when Wren was 17, her grandmother passed away quietly in the small apartment above the shop. Wren found her in the morning, sitting in her favorite chair beside the sewing machine, as though she had simply decided to rest for a moment and never woke up. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her reading glasses were still perched on her nose, and on the table beside her sat a cup of tea that had gone cold overnight. After the funeral, which Margot attended for exactly 20 minutes before leaving, without speaking to Wren, there was nothing left. No family, no safety net. No one to call when the world felt too large and too cold. Wren closed the shop, locked the door, moved to Seattle, and told herself that the only way to survive was to build a completely different life. A corporate life. A life with paychecks and structure and health insurance and people who judged your worth by your job title rather than whether you knew how to thread a bobbin. For 2 years, that plan had almost worked. Almost. And now, standing in the rain outside the building that had just erased her, Wren understood how fragile almost had always been. By sunset, she was driving south. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the November rain, and Wren gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles white. She had not been back to the coastal town since the day she locked the shop. She had avoided it deliberately, the way a person avoids a room where someone they loved once lived. But avoidance was a luxury she could no longer afford. The sewing shop was the only thing attached to the bank loan. If she could prepare it for sale quickly enough, she might find a buyer willing to move fast. The building was old and the neighborhood was quiet, but real estate was real estate. Maybe $15,000, maybe 18, maybe just enough to keep the bank from taking everything. When Wren pulled up to the curb outside the shop, the engine ticking in the cold air, she sat for a long time without moving. The storefront looked smaller than she remembered. Dust covered the windows so thickly that the glass appeared frosted. A vine had grown across the lower corner of the doorframe, its dried tendrils clinging to the wood like thin brown fingers. The hand-painted sign above the door had faded so badly that only fragments remained visible. Lenora's alterations and sewing. The letters that were once a deep, confident blue had turned to a ghostly gray, and in several places the paint had cracked and peeled away entirely, leaving bare wood exposed to the weather. Wren pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and sat there for a full minute. Then she got out of the car. The key still worked. When she pushed the door open, the little brass bell above the frame gave a weak, trembling ring, and Wren stopped breathing. She knew that sound. She had heard it 10,000 times as a child, racing through this doorway after school, calling for her grandmother before the bell had even stopped swinging. The memory hit her so hard that for a moment she could smell lavender and coffee and warm cotton, and she half expected to see Lenora sitting behind the machine, silver hair pinned neatly, looking up with that quiet smile that always meant the same thing. You are exactly where you belong. But there was only silence. Dust floating in the cold air like ash. Shelves sagging under the weight of fabric no one had touched in 2 years. The antique sewing machine sitting beneath a yellowed sheet, waiting for hands that would never return. A spider had built a web between the machine and the wall, and it swayed gently in the draft from the open door. The floorboards creaked beneath Wren's feet as she stepped inside, and the sound echoed through the empty shop like a voice in a church after the congregation has gone home. Wren swallowed hard. She was not here for memories. She was here to sell. She returned the next morning carrying cardboard boxes, trash bags, and a thermos of tea. The November air had turned bitter overnight, and the old storefront felt like a refrigerator. When she flipped the light switch, nothing happened. Of course, the electricity had been shut off months ago when Wren stopped paying the bill. She opened the curtains instead and let pale morning light spill across the room, revealing dust motes that swirled and drifted through the air like tiny ghosts disturbed from sleep. Then she began working. She sorted through boxes of buttons, rusted scissors, measuring tapes, faded paper patterns, and stacks of fabric that had not been touched in years. Most of it was worth almost nothing. A few dollars here, perhaps 20 there. She found a box of silk thread that might have been valuable once, but moisture had gotten in, and the spools were spotted with mold. She found a set of dressmaker's shears that Lenora had kept sharp enough to cut a single layer of chiffon without pulling. But even those were worth perhaps $30 at a craft fair. Certainly not enough to save her. Her phone vibrated against the cutting table. Wren glanced at the screen. Final payment notice. Her stomach tightened until it hurt. The bank wanted $4,860 within 12 days. 12 days. Wren lowered herself onto a wooden chair and pressed both hands over her face. I am trying, she whispered to no one. The shop answered with silence. During a break, she called a local real estate agent. The woman was polite but direct. The neighborhood had declined over the past several years. 2 other storefronts on the same block were already vacant. The building needed significant repairs, roof work, electrical updates, plumbing. A realistic listing price might be $15,000 to $18,000, but finding a buyer could take 2 to 3 months, possibly longer in the current market. Wren closed her eyes. She did not have 2 to 3 months. She had 12 days. Even selling the shop would not happen fast enough. She was trapped between a deadline that would not move and a building that could not sell fast enough to meet it. She returned to work, moving mechanically through the shelves, and near the back of the counter she found something that slowed her down. A leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and softened with age. She opened it carefully, afraid the binding might give way. Inside, in Lenora's careful handwriting, were hundreds of entries. Customer names, dates, garments, and notes that no ordinary bookkeeper would have written. Mrs. Pemberton, wedding dress, paid half, do not remind her. Mr. Yates, winter coat, no charge, lost his wife last month. Dawson family, 4 school uniforms, accepted 2 jars of blackberry jam as partial payment. Henderson, formal dress for daughter's graduation, payment plan, never mention it in front of other customers. Wren turned page after page. Her grandmother had given away more than she had ever collected. She had fed her customers' dignity while starving her own bank account. She had treated every person who walked through that door as though their need was more important than her income. For the first time, a question formed in Wren's mind that she could not answer. How had Lenora survived all those years running this shop? The numbers did not make sense. The generosity was too large and the income was too small. A shop that accepted blackberry jam as payment could not have survived on sewing alone. Something else must have kept this place alive. But what? Near noon, Wren reached the rear storage room. This was where Lenora had kept her unfinished projects, garments waiting for customers who sometimes never returned. The shelves were crowded with bundles of fabric wrapped in brown paper, each one labeled in Lenora's handwriting with dates that went back decades. Wren ran her fingers across the familiar letters and felt a dull ache settle behind her ribs. These bundles represented promises her grandmother had made to people who had trusted her with their clothing, their fabric, their memories. Some of the names Wren recognized. Others belonged to strangers, or perhaps to people who had moved away or passed on, leaving their unfinished alterations behind, like letters never picked up from the post office. Then, beneath a collapsed stack of old curtains piled in the corner, she noticed something large. She pulled it free and nearly lost her balance from the weight of it. It was a quilt, enormous and strangely heavy, far heavier than any quilt had a right to be. Wren frowned. Unlike Lenora's elegant finished work, this quilt looked incomplete. Its patchwork surface was made from dozens of mismatched pieces. Deep blue velvet beside faded red cotton. Cream-colored linen next to squares embroidered by hand. Some pieces were clearly old, their edges softened by years of handling. Others looked newer, as though they had been added at different times over a long period. And in the corner of one square, Wren recognized something that made her throat tight. A tiny yellow flower, stitched with a kind of precision that only came from decades of practice. Her grandmother used to sew that flower into anything she made for someone she loved. Every baby blanket, every birthday gift, every repair that mattered more than the others. It was Lenora's signature, her way of saying, without words, that the person holding this fabric was held in her heart. Wren spread the quilt across the old cutting table. Something about it felt wrong. Not emotionally, physically. One section near the bottom refused to fold naturally. It resisted her hands as though something rigid was hidden beneath the surface. Wren pressed her palm against it. Stiff. She tried another section. Soft, she returned to the first. Definitely stiff. Something was inside the fabric. Not batting, not interfacing. Something flat and rigid, sealed between the layers. Her heartbeat quickened. She pressed along the edges of the stiff area, trying to determine its shape and size. Rectangular, perhaps 6 inches by 9, thin but unyielding, like a piece of cardboard or a folded document. "Grandma, what did you put in here?" Wren turned the quilt over. The backing appeared ordinary, until she brought it closer to the window and angled it against the pale morning light. That was when she saw it. Along one edge ran two nearly identical seams. The first was old and faded, its threads softened by years. The second was tighter, more deliberate, stitched with a slightly different thread weight, and hidden so carefully that a casual observer would never have noticed the difference. But Wren had spent hundreds of childhood afternoons sitting beside this woman, watching her hands move cloth beneath the needle, with the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered her craft so thoroughly that every stitch was a decision, never an accident. She knew her grandmother's stitching the way a musician knows another musician's phrasing, and she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Lenora never added unnecessary stitches, never. Every thread served a purpose. Every seam existed for a reason. If there were two seams where one would suffice, the second one was not a mistake. It was a message. Wren reached for a small seam ripper from the table, then stopped. What if she destroyed the last thing Lenora had ever made? Her fingers trembled. She held the tool above the fabric and felt a war between reverence and curiosity that lasted several long seconds. She almost put the tool down. Almost. Then her fingertips brushed the shape beneath the fabric again. Flat. Rectangular. Deliberate. Whatever was hidden inside had been sealed there on purpose, and Lenora had marked it with the yellow flower, the flower she only stitched for someone she loved. Wren slipped the metal tip beneath the first stitch. One thread snapped, then another, and another. The opening widened by half an inch, then an inch. She reached inside with 2 fingers. Her fingertips touched paper. She went completely still. The shop was impossibly quiet. Outside, a car passed, its tires hissing on the wet road. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then fell silent. But Wren heard only the blood rushing through her ears and the faint whisper of her own breathing. She continued cutting until there was enough space to slide her hand inside. She grasped the object carefully, felt its edges, its thickness, and pulled it free with the slow precision of someone removing a splinter from beneath a child's skin. It was wrapped in waxed cloth, yellowed with age and slightly stiff, and tied with a narrow piece of blue ribbon. Wren stared at it. Her hands were shaking. She placed it on the cutting table beneath the window where the light was strongest. She slowly untied the ribbon. The waxed cloth unfolded in her hands, releasing a faint smell of cedar and old paper, the kind of smell that belongs to attics and archive rooms and the drawers of antique desks. Inside was a folded document. The paper was thick, brittle at the edges, yet remarkably well preserved, as though someone had taken deliberate care to protect it from moisture and light and the slow erosion of time. Across the top were words printed in an old-fashioned typeface, the kind of heavy, official lettering used on legal documents from another era. Wren read the first line, then read it again. Her knees weakened and she grabbed the edge of the cutting table to keep from falling. This was not a letter. It was not a family photograph. It was not her grandmother's will. It was a property deed, a legal instrument describing a specific parcel of land, its boundaries, its survey markers, and the chain of ownership connecting it to a family name Wren, recognized as her own. And beneath the legal description was a parcel number connected to a piece of land that Wren had heard about only once in her childhood, a supposedly worthless family property that everyone believed had been lost or abandoned generations ago. She remembered Lenora mentioning it casually one evening while mending a torn curtain. Something about land her father had inherited. Something about patience. Wren had been too young to understand and had never thought about it again, until now. Along the bottom of the deed, in handwriting Wren recognized instantly, her grandmother had written a single sentence. What survives is not always what people can see. Wren stood motionless in the failing afternoon light. 12 days earlier, this document would have meant nothing to her. Yesterday, she had not even known it existed. But now, standing inside the shop she intended to sell, holding a secret her grandmother had sewn into the lining of an unfinished quilt, Wren felt something she had not felt since reading that termination email. Hope. Fragile, terrifying, unreasonable hope. The kind that arrives uninvited and refuses to leave. Even when every rational thought tells you that hope is the most dangerous thing a desperate person can carry. She still did not know what the land was worth. She did not know whether the deed was legally valid after all these years. And she certainly did not understand why Lenora had hidden it inside a quilt, instead of placing in a safe or a filing cabinet or a safety deposit box, like any reasonable person would. But one thing was suddenly clear. Her grandmother had sewn that second seam for a reason. And whatever truth lay behind it had been waiting, patiently, silently, for years or perhaps decades, for someone to find it. Waiting for Emily. No, waiting for Wren. By the next morning, Wren was sitting inside the county records office with the deed resting on the counter in front of her. She had barely slept. The document had sat on her kitchen table all night, and every 30 minutes she had gotten up from bed to check that it was still there, half convinced that by morning it would turn out to be a dream. But it was real. The paper was real. The ink was real. And now she needed someone to tell her whether the land was real too. The clerk behind the desk was a gray-haired man named Owen Bridwell, who looked as though he had been working in this building since the filing cabinets were new. He had deep lines around his eyes and the deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades examining documents that other people had lost, forgotten, or never known existed. He examined the deed beneath his desk lamp, turning it carefully, studying the seals and signatures and parcel number, with the focused attention of a jeweler examining a stone brought in by a stranger. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Where did you get this? My grandmother hid it inside a quilt. Owen looked up. A quilt? Wren nodded. He studied the document for another long moment, running his thumb along the embossed seal at the bottom, then disappeared into the records room without another word. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Wren sat in the plastic chair and watched the clock on the wall and tried not to think about what she would do if Owen came back and told her the deed was worthless. She checked her phone. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. Another email from the bank, the subject line in capital letters, a digital shout that she could feel, even without opening it. She refused to open it. She put the phone face down on her lap and sat on her hands like a child waiting outside the principal's office. The records office smelled of old paper and toner and the faintly metallic tang of filing cabinets that had been opened and closed 10,000 times. A woman at the next window was arguing about a property line dispute with her neighbor. A teenager sat in the corner filling out forms with a pen that kept running out of ink. The clock on the wall ticked with the slow, indifferent regularity of a machine that does not care what news you are waiting for. At 37 minutes, Owen finally returned carrying a thick folder. He sat down slowly, placed the folder on the counter, and removed his glasses. The deed appears authentic. The parcel number exists in our system, and the historical records match the names on your document. You will need a title attorney to confirm everything, but what I can tell you is that this land has never been formally transferred out of your family's name. Wren stared at him. So my family still owns it? Owen hesitated. That is where this becomes interesting. He turned his computer monitor toward her. A digital map filled the screen. Wren expected to see an empty field somewhere outside town, perhaps several forgotten acres covered with weeds and bordered by a gravel road, the kind of land that people inherit and forget about because it produces nothing and costs just enough in taxes to be annoying. Instead, Owen zoomed in on a dense cluster of roads, glass-fronted office buildings, luxury apartment complexes, restaurants with outdoor seating, and construction cranes rising above half-finished towers. The area was alive with development. New buildings in various stages of construction stood alongside recently completed structures that gleamed in the satellite imagery. Wren leaned closer to the screen. I do not understand. Owen pointed to an outlined section near the center of the development. That is the parcel described in your deed. Wren looked at him, then back at the screen. She blinked. No, that cannot be right. The land was not sitting in the middle of nowhere. It was located inside one of the fastest-growing commercial development districts in the entire region. Roads ran through it. Buildings surrounded it. Construction equipment sat on adjacent lots. And right in the center of all that activity, outlined in red on Owen's screen, was a parcel of land that legally belonged to a dead seamstress who had hidden the deed inside a quilt. Owen printed several records, including historical tax filings, survey references, and a chain of title summary. He suggested she speak with a real estate attorney immediately. Wren left the building in a daze, clutching the folder against her chest, the same way she had clutched the cardboard box outside the corporate office 2 days earlier. But this time, the weight she carried felt entirely different. 2 hours later, Wren was sitting across from Nathan Alcott, a property attorney whose office overlooked downtown Seattle. Nathan was in his 50s, deliberate in his speech, careful with his conclusions, and clearly surprised by what he was reading. He studied the deed, the historical records Owen had provided, and the parcel information for nearly 40 minutes without speaking. Then he made several phone calls, while Wren sat in silence, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers ached. She watched his face for any sign of bad news. Nathan's expression remained professionally neutral, but she noticed that with each phone call, he sat slightly straighter in his chair. Finally, Nathan removed his glasses and looked at her directly. Wren, I need you to understand something. If the title history checks out the way I believe it will, this is not a worthless family plot. A commercial development company has recently purchased several neighboring parcels for a major mixed-use project. Luxury residences, retail space, office towers, a hotel. Your grandmother's parcel sits directly along the planned commercial corridor connecting the entire development. Wren could barely hear him over the sound of her own heartbeat. How much is it worth? Nathan paused. I cannot give you an exact valuation without a formal appraisal. But based on comparable sales in the area and the strategic location of the parcel, we are looking at potentially several $1 million. Silence filled the room. Wren actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because her brain simply refused to accept the number. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had been sorting through boxes of rusty scissors and moldy thread that morning. Yesterday, she had been wondering whether she could sell Lenora's sewing machine for a few $100s. She had been calculating whether she could afford groceries for the rest of the month. She had considered asking the real estate agent whether anyone might pay cash for the shop's antique cutting table. And now a man in a downtown office was telling her that her grandmother, the woman who patched her own winter coat rather than buy a new one, who accepted jars of blackberry jam as payment for school uniform forms, had been sitting on land worth millions of dollars for her entire adult life. The tears came without warning, not graceful tears, not the kind that movie characters shed while looking beautiful. The kind that come when months of fear break loose all at once. Wren cried for the job she had lost, for the parents who died on a wet highway when she was 7, for the aunt who refused to take her in, for the grandmother who did, and for the unbearable, almost impossible possibility that hidden beneath layers of cheap fabric and careful stitching, Lenora Calloway had left behind the one thing that could change everything. But Nathan was not finished. There is something else you should know. He placed another set of photocopied records in front of her. The property had faced multiple transfer attempts over the decades. Offers to purchase from private buyers, legal inquiries from development firms, tax challenges from the county when payments arrived late, zoning disputes when neighboring parcels were rezoned for commercial use. Yet somehow, each time ownership had been preserved. Signatures, renewals, tax payments, legal filings. Different years, different pressures, the same result. Someone had been actively protecting this land for decades, paying the taxes, renewing the filings, responding to every legal challenge, year after year after year. Nathan traced his finger along the timeline of records. Look at this pattern, he said. In 1994, someone filed a tax lien challenge. It was resolved within 60 days. In 2003, a development company made a purchase inquiry. It was declined in writing. In 2011, the county reassessed the property value and increased the tax obligation by 40%. The new amount was paid in full within 3 months. Whoever maintained this property was not passive. They were engaged, informed, and absolutely committed to keeping it in the family. Wren stared at the dates. Some of them fell during periods when she knew her grandmother had been struggling to keep the sewing shop open. The 2011 tax increase, a 40% jump, had arrived during the same year. Wren remembered the shop's heating system failing for the second time. Lenora had repaired it herself with parts she found at a salvage yard rather than calling a professional. Wren had thought it was because her grandmother was stubborn and old-fashioned. Now, she understood it was because the money that should have gone to a proper repair had been sent to the county tax office instead. Years when Lenora ate canned soup for dinner and told Wren she simply was not hungry. Years when she wore the same cardigan from October through March because buying a new one would have meant choosing between warmth and the tax payment on a piece of land no one in the family even remembered. Wren looked at the records spread across Nathan's desk and felt a pressure building behind her eyes that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming realization of what her grandmother had done. Lenora had known exactly what the land might become, and she had chosen, every single year for more than 4 decades, to protect it at the cost of her own comfort, her own health, her own dignity. She had gone hungry so the taxes would be paid on time. She had worn patched clothing so the filing fees would be current. She had lived like a woman with nothing, so that someday, someone she loved would have everything. Wren returned to the sewing shop before sunset. On the drive back from Nathan's office, she passed through the coastal town's main street and noticed things she had been too desperate to see when she arrived 2 days earlier. The bakery on the corner was still open, its windows fogged with warmth. The hardware store still had the same faded awning it had worn since Wren was a child. And 3 doors down, from the sewing shop, a woman was sweeping the sidewalk in front of a small cafe, moving with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had been sweeping that same sidewalk for years and saw no reason to rush. The town had not changed. It had simply continued without her, the way a river continues after someone stops watching it. When Wren unlocked the shop door, a woman was standing on the sidewalk nearby, watching her. She was in her late 60s, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair cut short, and the kind of face that suggested she had opinions about everything and the confidence to share them. She introduced herself as Grace Pemberton. She had known Lenora for more than 30 years. She had seen Wren's car parked outside the shop the previous evening and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Wren thanked her and said she was fine, which was not true. But Grace seemed to understand the difference between what people say when they are struggling and what they actually mean. She left her phone number on a piece of paper and told Wren to call if she needed anything at all. Then she walked away, and Wren stood in the doorway watching her go and wondering how many people in this town still remembered the woman who had repaired their coats and hemmed their dresses and accepted blackberry jam as payment. The sky had turned the color of bruised plums, and the last light of the day came through the dusty windows at a low angle that made every surface in the shop glow with a warm amber hue. She spread the unfinished quilt across the cutting table once more. This time she did not see scraps. She saw a map of sacrifice. Every patch represented something Lenora had chosen to preserve rather than discard. Every stitch joined one fragile piece to another until together they formed something strong enough to survive across generations. The quilt was not unfinished because Lenora had run out of time. It was unfinished because it was never meant to be a quilt at all. It was a hiding place, a vault made of fabric and thread. Then Wren noticed something she had missed. Inside the opening where the deed had been hidden, there was a second, much smaller pocket, sewn into the lining with the same deliberate care. It was so flat that she had not felt it when she removed the deed. Her pulse jumped. She reached inside with 2 careful fingers. There was a folded piece of paper, smaller than the deed, written entirely in Lenora's handwriting. On the outside, only 4 words, for the one who needs it. Wren's hands trembled. She slowly unfolded the letter, and as she read the first sentence, she realized that the property deed had never been accidentally forgotten inside that quilt. Her grandmother had planned everything, not for herself, not even for the next generation. Lenora had been waiting for the specific moment when someone in her family reached the point where there seemed to be nothing left to lose. And somehow, years before Wren lost her job, before she stood in the rain outside a corporate building clutching a cardboard box, before she drove desperately back to this abandoned shop, Lenora had prepared for exactly that moment. She had prepared it the way she prepared everything, carefully, quietly, with stitches so precise that no one would notice until the moment they needed to. But it was the final paragraph that changed everything. Wren read it 3 times, each time more slowly than the last. Lenora's handwriting grew slightly unsteady at the end, as though she had written these words, knowing they might be the most important she would ever leave behind. There are those in our family who tried to take this land before. They will try again when they learn what it is worth. Trust no one who abandoned you when you needed them most. Wren lowered the letter. The shop was nearly dark now. Rain tapped against the dusty windows in an uneven rhythm. The old building creaked as the wind pressed against its walls, and somewhere above her, in the apartment where Lenora had lived and died, a pipe groaned softly. And Wren stood perfectly still because she understood exactly who her grandmother was warning her about. There was only one person in Wren's family who had ever abandoned her. Only one person who had looked at a 7-year-old orphan and decided she was not worth the trouble. Aunt Margot, the woman who had refused to take Wren in after her parents died. The woman who had not spoken to Wren in 12 years. The woman who had walked into Lenora's funeral 20 minutes late and walked out without saying a single word to the girl sitting alone in the front row. Lenora had known, even then, that if the land ever became valuable, Margot would return. Not out of love, not out of duty, not out of the guilt she should have carried every day since refusing to raise her dead sister's child. Out of greed. Wren folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her jacket, close to her chest, where she could feel the paper shift against her skin whenever she moved. She looked around the darkening shop. 24 hours ago, this place had been a burden, a decaying building, a last resort. A piece of real estate she intended to trade for enough money to keep the bank satisfied for a few more months. Now it held a secret worth millions, a grandmother's lifetime of sacrifice, and a warning about a war that had not yet begun but was already on its way. Wren did not know what the coming days would bring. She did not know whether the deed would survive legal scrutiny, whether the land could be sold in time to save her, or whether the woman Lenora had warned her about would appear from the silence of 12 years and try to take what was never hers. But standing alone in the shop, where she had been loved more completely than anywhere else on earth, Wren made a decision. She was not going to run. She was not going to sell this place to the first buyer who walked through the door, and she was not going to let anyone, not the bank, not a developer, and certainly not the aunt who'd thrown her away like an inconvenient piece of mail, take what Lenora Calloway had spent a lifetime protecting. Whatever came next, Wren would face it the way her grandmother had taught her, one stitch at a time. That night, Wren did not sleep. She sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment, above the shop with Lenora's letters spread open beneath the glow of a single lamp. Rain continued to fall against the windows, and the old building settled around her, with the familiar creaks and groans she remembered from childhood. But the sounds that had once meant safety now carried a different weight. Somewhere beyond the walls of this shop, a storm was gathering that had nothing to do with weather. She read the letter again from the beginning. This time slowly. This time with the understanding that every sentence had been written not as a memory, but as a set of instructions from a woman who had spent her life preparing for a battle she knew she would not live to fight. If you are reading this, then our family has finally reached the day when this land can give more than it takes. Lenora explained that she had learned about the property when she was a young woman. Her own father had inherited it from his parents, a modest parcel on the outskirts of what was then a quiet, unremarkable stretch of county land. For decades, the property produced almost nothing. The taxes were small but constant, a bill that arrived every year like a clock that could not be stopped. There had been offers to sell, most of them insultingly low. Some relatives wanted quick money. Others considered the property a useless expense and wanted to be rid of it entirely. But Lenora refused to let it go. She believed, with a certainty that no one else in the family shared, that the city would eventually grow toward that land. She just did not know when. So she waited, year after year, decade after decade. While the rest of the family forgot the land existed, Lenora paid the taxes, renewed the filings, and kept the deed current. She carried the property the way a person carries a stone in their pocket, always aware of its weight, always choosing to bear it anyway. And waiting had cost her more than Wren had ever understood. There were years when Lenora could barely pay the heating bill at the sewing shop. Winters when she worked 12-hour days repairing coats and hemming uniforms while wearing the same thin cardigan she had owned for 6 years. Its elbows worn so thin that the fabric had turned translucent, and she had patched it from the inside with scraps of flannel so that customers would not notice. Wren remembered one Christmas when she was 9 years old. She had been sitting on the floor beside the sewing machine, wrapping a small gift she had made for her grandmother from scraps of ribbon, and she asked why Lenora never bought herself presents. Her grandmother had smiled, the kind of smile that held something heavy behind it, and said, "Some things are more beautiful when you save them for later." Wren had thought she was talking about money, or perhaps about patience. Now, reading the letter in the dim light of the apartment where Lenora had lived and died, Wren understood what her grandmother had actually meant. She had been talking about the future, about this exact moment, about the day when a girl with nothing left would find a document sewn inside a quilt and realize that every sacrifice, every skipped meal, every refused offer, every winter spent in a patched cardigan had been made for her. The letter described one particular year that nearly broke Lenora. An offer arrived for the land, higher than any previous one, enough to pay every debt she had and repair the shop from floor to ceiling and buy a new winter coat and still have money left over. The amount would have changed her life. She could have retired. She could have closed the shop and lived comfortably for the rest of her years. Instead, Lenora refused. She took additional sewing work at night. She repaired wedding dresses after closing, working by the light of a single lamp until her eyes burned and her shoulders ached. She hemmed military uniforms before sunrise. She skipped vacations she had never taken anyway. She delayed repairs to the shop that were already overdue. She ate less. She told no one why. The land remained in her name. The taxes were paid on time. And the secret stayed hidden inside an unfinished quilt that no one thought to examine. Wren pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. She had spent years being embarrassed by this place. After Lenora died, Wren had wanted nothing to do with sewing, with fabric, with the tiny shop, where everybody knew her grandmother by name and where the most sophisticated technology was a 40-year-old sewing machine and a pair of scissors sharp enough to cut silk. She had wanted glass offices, a corporate title, a salary that made people take her seriously when she walked into a room. And for 2 years, she had believed she was building something better, something more permanent, something the world would respect, until one email erased it all in seconds. Her corporate title had felt permanent. It was not. Her paycheck had felt like security. It was not. Her grandmother's little shop had looked fragile and insignificant and stuck in the past. Yet somehow, it was the thing that had survived. Wren placed the letter carefully back inside its fold. There was nothing more to read, but there was everything left to protect. 2 days later, her phone rang at 7 in the morning. The number was unfamiliar. Wren answered it standing behind the counter of the shop, where she had been sorting through a box of old receipts, looking for anything that might help Nathan build the title history. The voice on the other end was female, carefully composed and completely unexpected. "Wren, this is your Aunt Margot." Wren's hand tightened around the phone. She had not heard that voice in years. Not since the funeral, where Margot had arrived, 20 minutes late, in an expensive black coat, stood at the back of the room without approaching the casket, spoken to no one, and left before the service ended. In the 2 years since, Margot had not called, had not written, had not sent a card on Wren's birthday, or checked whether the girl her sister had begged her to raise was alive or dead or sleeping in a doorway somewhere. Now, suddenly, here she was, and the timing was not a coincidence. Margot said she had heard that Wren was doing something with Lenora's property. She did not say how she had heard, and Wren did not ask, though the question burned in her throat like smoke. She said she believed she had a rightful interest in the family's assets as the surviving sister of Wren's mother. She spoke calmly, as though she were discussing a business arrangement rather than the inheritance of a woman who had spent 40 years protecting a secret, while Margot spent those same 40 years pretending both Lenora and Wren did not exist. Wren listened until Margot finished. Then she said, "My mother wanted you to take care of me. You said no. You told the social worker I would be better off with someone who actually wanted me. I was 7 years old, standing behind a door, and I heard you say it." The line went silent for 3 full seconds. Wren could hear Margot breathing. Then Marceau said, "That was a long time ago, Wren. We were all in a difficult position." Wren said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. "Whatever you think of me," Margot continued, "I have legal standing in this family, and I intend to exercise it. My son Derek is an attorney. You will be hearing from him." The call ended. Wren stared at the phone in her hand. The screen went dark, and she could see her own reflection in the glass, pale and wide-eyed and looking far younger than 19. Lenora's warning echoed through her mind with a clarity that felt almost physical. Trust no one who abandoned you when you needed them most. Her grandmother had predicted this moment with devastating accuracy. She had known Margot better than Margot knew herself. That same afternoon, Nathan called with news that turned the warning into an emergency. A man named Derek Sable had contacted his office. Derek was Margot's son, a litigation attorney in his early 30s, who used his father's surname professionally. He had informed Nathan that he intended to file a formal challenge to Wren's claim on the family property, arguing that Lenora had no legal right to exclude other family members from inherited assets. His tone, Nathan reported, had been polished but aggressive, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned to make threats sound like favors. Nathan's own voice was steady but serious. If Derek files a caveat with the court, it could freeze all transactions involving the property for months. No sale, no mortgage, no advance agreements. Nothing moves until the court resolves the dispute. Wren felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had 9 days before the bank demanded $4,860. If the property was frozen, she could not use it to secure any kind of financial relief. She would lose the shop, the only asset attached to her loan. And the land Lenora had spent a lifetime protecting would be tied up in a legal battle that Margot and Derek could afford to fight far longer than a 19-year-old girl with an empty savings account and no income. Nathan told her what they needed. We have to prove that Lenora's sole ownership was intentional and documented, not inherited by accident, not held through oversight, deliberately maintained, legally supported year after year. If we can establish that chain clearly, Derek's challenge collapses before it starts. But if we cannot, this could drag on for a very long time. 4 days later, Margot and Derek arrived at the shop. Wren saw them through the front window before they reached the door. Margot wore a tailored gray coat and expensive leather boots and carried herself with the posture of a woman who expected to be accommodated in every room she entered. Derek walked beside her in a dark suit that probably cost more than everything inside the shop combined. He was tall, lean, and carried a leather briefcase that he set on the cutting table without asking permission, as though the table already belonged to him. His eyes moved across the dusty interior of the shop with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was certainly not respect. He was cataloging everything he saw, measuring it, dismissing it, the way a person measures a building before deciding whether it is worth demolishing. Margot looked around the dusty interior with an expression that hovered between nostalgia and performance. "This was my sister's mother-in-law's place," she said softly. "I have memories here." Wren said nothing. She knew for a fact that Margot had never once visited the shop while Lenora was alive. Not once in 40 years. Every memory Margot claimed to have was fabricated, and both of them knew it. Derek opened his briefcase and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. He spoke without warmth and without introduction. "We are prepared to offer a 50-50 split of all family property interests. This avoids litigation, avoids delays, and allows both parties to move forward efficiently." Wren looked at the paper but did not touch it. "This property belongs to me. Lenora left it to me." Derek's expression did not change. Courts do not always agree with what grandmothers intended. They care about bloodlines, legal standing, and documented rights. You are 19 years old with no legal representation beyond a small town property attorney. We can make this very difficult for you, or we can make it simple. The choice is entirely yours, Sergeant. Wren felt her pulse hammering in her throat, but she kept her voice level. "No." Margot stepped forward. Her voice was softer than Derek's, but the purpose behind it was identical. "Wren, your grandmother was a sweet old woman, but she was not thinking clearly toward the end. You must know that. Surely you noticed the signs, the forgetfulness, the confusion, the decisions that did not make sense." Wren looked directly at her aunt. "She was thinking more clearly than anyone in this family, and she warned me about you." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Derek closed his briefcase without looking at Wren. Margot adjusted her coat. They turned and walked out without another word, and the brass bell above the door rang behind them like a small, defiant alarm. But after they were gone, Wren noticed something that made her stomach drop. While she had been focused on Margot, Derek had positioned himself near the cutting table where several of Nathan's preliminary documents were spread out. Wren checked the papers. They were all still there. Nothing was missing. But when she looked at the small security camera she had installed 2 days earlier on Nathan's advice, mounted above the entrance and angled toward the table, she saw what had actually happened. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. While Wren had been staring at Margot, Derek had used his phone held low beside his hip to photograph 3 of the documents on the table. He had done it casually without looking down, as though photographing confidential legal papers in someone else's property was as natural as checking the time. Wren called Nathan immediately. He confirmed what she already suspected. It was a reconnaissance visit. They came to gather information, not to negotiate. Derek wanted to see what evidence we have and what we are missing. Now he knows both. The next morning brought a different kind of pressure from a different direction. A man named Harlan Jessup left a message at Nathan's office, requesting a meeting with Wren. Nathan identified him quickly through public business filings. Harlan was a senior representative of the Caraway Development Group, a major commercial developer that had been assembling land parcels throughout the district throughout the surrounding Wren's property for more than a decade. Nathan's research revealed something else that made the situation considerably more complicated. Caraway had attempted to purchase Lenora's parcel 3 separate times over the past 15 years. Each time the offer had been refused. Each time Lenora had said no without explanation, without negotiation, without leaving a door open for future discussions. 3 times in 15 years, a corporation with lawyers and money and patience had knocked on Lenora's door. And 3 times a woman in a tiny sewing shop had told them no and gone back to hemming trousers. Wren's grandmother had not only been protecting the land from her own family. She had been holding the line against a corporation that wanted to absorb every piece of property in the area. Wren agreed to meet Harlan at a restaurant near the waterfront. Nathan advised her to listen carefully and agree to nothing. She arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window where the light was good and she could watch Harlan approach. She wanted to see him before he saw her. She wanted to watch the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the way he arranged his face before walking through a door. People reveal themselves in the moments before they know they are being observed. Harlan arrived in an expensive overcoat, ordered coffee he never touched, and smiled with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades convincing people to sell things they did not want to sell. He had silver hair cut short and hands that had clearly never repaired a sewing machine or patched a winter coat. His watch was the kind of watch that exists not to tell time, but to tell other people how much money you have. He told Wren he understood her situation. The legal dispute with her aunt, the bank deadline, the stress of managing a complicated inheritance at such a young age. He spoke about all of it, with a sympathy that felt rehearsed, as though he had given this exact speech to other property owners before, and knew precisely where to pause for effect. Then he placed a folder on the table. Inside was a purchase offer, $1.2 million for the parcel. Wren stared at the number. It was significant. It was more money than she had ever imagined having. It would solve every immediate problem in her life. But it was less than half of what Nathan had estimated the land was worth. Harlan leaned forward. The legal dispute with your aunt could drag on for years. Courts are slow. Attorneys are expensive. And during that time, you receive nothing. Meanwhile, the bank does not care about your family dispute. The bank only cares about its payment. This offer gives you certainty, Wren. It gives you a future today, not someday. Wren studied his face. His expression was generous, open, concerned, but his eyes were still. They watched her the way a person watches a clock, measuring time, waiting for the right moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since she learned that Caraway had tried to buy the land 3 times before. How did my aunt find out about the property? Harlan's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes shifted, a small adjustment, like a curtain being drawn an inch to the side. Property activity generates public records, he said. Anyone paying attention would notice. That was not an answer, and they both knew it. Wren closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I need time to think about it. Harlan nodded, but his expression carried a warning that had nothing to do with generosity. Do not take too long. Offers like this have expiration dates. That evening, Nathan confirmed what Wren suspected. Harlan and Margot were not formally working together. There was no contract, no partnership agreement, no paper trail connecting them. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Margot's sudden reappearance after 12 years of silence coincided precisely with Caraway's renewed interest in the property. Whether Harlan had tipped Margot off directly or information had traveled through channels less traceable, the effect was the same. Margot's legal challenge served Harlan's purpose perfectly. The longer the dispute dragged on, the more desperate Wren would become, the more pressure the bank would apply, and the cheaper Harlan could buy the land. They did not need to conspire openly. They simply needed Wren to break. 2 days later, Grace Pemberton knocked on the shop door for the second time. She was carrying a box of old photographs and a casserole dish covered in foil. Wren had been sitting behind the cutting table staring at the bank's latest message on her phone. 5 days remaining. The numbers on the screen seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Grace set the casserole on the counter and looked at Wren with the directness of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize when someone was drowning. "You look like you have not eaten today." Wren admitted she had not. She had been living on tea and crackers for 3 days, not because she had run out of food, but because the anxiety in her stomach left no room for anything else. Grace heated 2 plates on the small stove upstairs, and they sat together at Lenora's kitchen table. The same table where Wren had read the letter. The same table where she had watched her grandmother eat canned soup for dinner, while insisting she simply was not hungry. The parallel was not lost on her. They ate in silence for a while. The casserole was chicken and rice, seasoned with rosemary and thyme, and it was the best thing Wren had eaten in weeks. She realized as she cleaned her plate that she could not remember the last time someone had cooked for her, not heated something up, not handed her a takeout container, actually cooked for her with fresh ingredients and care, and the understanding that food prepared by another person's hands carries a kind of warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. Grace told Wren stories about Lenora while they ate. Small stories, the kind that accumulate over 30 years of knowing someone. How Lenora used to bring fresh flowers to the shop every Monday, even in winter, because she believed a room with flowers in it was a room people wanted to stay in. How she taught free sewing lessons to any teenager who asked, because she believed that knowing how to repair your own clothing was a form of independence that no employer could take away. How she once stayed up all night to finish a wedding dress for a woman whose seamstress had abandoned the project 3 days before the ceremony. And how she charged the woman half price because she said no one should start a marriage feeling cheated. After a while, Wren asked the question she had been carrying since Margot's visit. "Did you ever see my aunt come to this shop?" Grace set her fork down slowly. The warmth in her expression did not change, but something beneath it hardened. "Once, about 10 years ago, your aunt came demanding that Lenora sell the family land and split the money. She was loud, aggressive. She stood right where you are sitting now and told Lenora that the land was a waste of money and that holding on to it was foolish and selfish. She said Lenora was throwing away the family's future because she was too stubborn to admit the land would never be worth anything." Wren leaned forward. "What did my grandmother say?" Grace's expression softened with what looked like admiration and something deeper, something that might have been awe. Lenora barely raised her voice. She stood behind that cutting table, straight as a needle, and she said, "I have protected this land for longer than you have wanted it. And I have the paperwork to prove every year." Then she asked Margot to leave, and Margot left. Grace paused. "I was in the back room when it happened. I heard every word. Your grandmother was not a woman who made idle claims." Wren felt something click into place with almost audible precision. The paperwork to prove every year. Lenora had told Margot directly that documentation existed. And if Lenora had said it, then it was true, because Lenora Calloway did not bluff. She did not exaggerate. She did not say things she could not prove. If she said the paperwork existed, then it was somewhere in this shop. Hidden the way everything important in Lenora's life had been hidden, in plain sight, behind something ordinary. That night, Wren and Nathan searched the shop with a focus that bordered on obsession. They moved every shelf away from the walls, opened every drawer, checked behind every framed picture, and beneath every loose floorboard. They pulled fabric from shelves, and examined the backs of cabinets and ran their fingers along the underside of every surface. Near midnight, Wren pulled open the narrow drawer built into the base of Lenora's antique sewing machine. A drawer she had opened hundreds of times as a child looking for spare bobbins and needles, and the small scissors Lenora kept for cutting thread. But this time, in the dim light, she noticed something she had never noticed before. The drawer was shallower than the cabinet that held it. Not by much, perhaps 2 inches. But 2 inches was enough to hide something flat. Wren reached behind the drawer and felt along the back panel. Her fingers found a small metal latch, cold and slightly rough with age. When she pressed it, a section of the base swung open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the machine that had been invisible for as long as Wren could remember. Inside was a large manila envelope, sealed with tape that had turned brittle and yellow. The envelope was thick, heavy enough that Wren felt its weight shift when she tilted it. She and Nathan looked at each other. Then, Wren carefully broke the seal and slid the contents onto the cutting table. Documents fanned out across the surface, like cards dealt from a deck that had been held for decades, waiting for the right hand to play them. Nathan leaned forward and began examining each one with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was holding could win or lose a case. Property tax receipts for the land, paid annually, spanning more than 40 years. Every single one in Lenora's name. A notarized copy of Lenora's father's will, dated decades earlier, explicitly naming Lenora as the sole inheritor of the property, with no mention of Lenora's sister, who was Margot's mother. And 3 letters from an attorney Lenora had retained at different points over the years, each one confirming the legal standing of her sole ownership and responding to inquiries that appeared to have come from other family members attempting to claim a share. Nathan sat back in his chair and exhaled. He was not a man given to emotional displays, but Wren saw something in his eyes that looked very much like respect. Your grandmother built a fortress, 40 years of unbroken documentation, continuous tax payments without a single gap, a will that specifically names her as sole heir, legal correspondence defending her ownership against multiple challenges from her own family. He looked at Wren. Derek's case has no foundation. This is not a gray area. Lenora did not accidentally end up with this land. She fought for it, paid for it, and documented every single year. She built a legal wall around this property one receipt at a time, and she did it while running a shop that accepted blackberry jam as payment. But Derek's sable was not finished. Despite the evidence Nathan had begun assembling, Derek filed his formal challenge with the court 3 days later. His argument was clever, and it bypassed the question of ownership entirely. Instead, Derek attacked Lenora's mental competency during the final years of her life. He claimed that Lenora had shown signs of cognitive decline, and that any decisions she made regarding property disposition after a certain date should be considered legally unreliable. It was a surgical strike aimed not at the land itself, but at the person who had protected it. If the court agreed even to hear the argument, every transaction involving the property, including any potential sale, would be frozen indefinitely while the question of Lenora's mental state was investigated. The news hit Wren like a physical blow. Nathan explained what a competency challenge meant in practical terms. Derek did not need to prove Lenora was incompetent. He only needed to create enough doubt that a judge would order an investigation. That investigation could take months. Expert witnesses, medical records review, testimony from neighbors and acquaintances. And during the entire process, every financial instrument attached to the property would be locked. No advance agreements, no preliminary payments, no bridge loans using the land as collateral. The property would exist in legal limbo, technically hers, but practically unreachable. Like money sealed behind glass she could see through but not break. Wren sat alone in the darkening shop that evening with her phone showing the bank's countdown. 5 days. She had the documentation. She had the legal standing. She had everything Lenora had spent a lifetime assembling. But none of it mattered if a single court filing could lock everything in place long enough for the bank to foreclose on the shop, which was the only address attached to her loan. For the first time since finding the deed, Wren doubted her grandmother. Maybe Lenora had made a mistake. Maybe keeping everything secret for so long, hiding deeds and quilts and documents behind sewing machines, had been an act of stubbornness rather than strategy. Maybe a woman who hid a multi-million-dollar deed inside a piece of unfinished patchwork, instead of placing it in a bank vault, had not been thinking as clearly as Wren wanted to believe. The next morning, a visitor arrived who changed everything. Hazel Drummond was 74 years old, stood barely 5 feet tall, and walked with the careful deliberation of a woman who had survived enough winters to respect every step she took. She had been a costume designer for a regional theater company for 30 years before retiring, and she had known Lenora Calloway for most of her adult life. They had been part of the same sewing circle, a group of women who met twice a month at the community center to work on projects together and teach each other techniques. Hazel arrived at the shop carrying a canvas bag and a look of quiet determination that reminded Wren so sharply of her grandmother that she nearly lost her composure at the door. Hazel had heard about the legal challenge. Small towns carry news the way rivers carry water, swiftly and without asking permission. And Margot's claim had reached every person who had ever known Lenora within days. Hazel sat down across from Wren at the cutting table and spoke with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and had come prepared to fight. Your grandmother was the sharpest woman I ever knew, and I have known a great many sharp women. 8 months before she passed, she was helping me calculate fabric costs for a theater production. She caught an error in my numbers that I had missed 3 times. She was teaching embroidery techniques to our sewing circle that same week, explaining stitch counts and tension adjustments with the kind of clarity that made you feel embarrassed you had not understood them before. And she was filing her own taxes without assistance correctly, as she had done every year for decades. That woman did not have a confused bone in her body. Hazel opened her canvas bag and pulled out a tablet computer. She turned it toward Wren. On the screen was a video, filmed on a phone during one of the sewing circle meetings, showing Lenora standing at the front of a small room demonstrating a complex embroidery pattern, while explaining the technique in clear, detailed language. Her hands were steady. Her words were precise. Her eyes were focused and alert. She paused at one point to correct a small mistake one of the participants had made, and she did it with such gentle authority that the woman thanked her and asked her to repeat the instruction. The video was dated 8 months before her death, well within the period Derek was attempting to challenge. Hazel looked at Wren. I will testify to this in any court that will have me, and so will every woman who sat in that circle. 6 of us are still alive, and every one of us will stand up and say the same thing. Your grandmother did not lose her mind. She was one of the most deliberate, intentional people who ever lived. Everything she did on purpose, including hiding that deed. Wren called Nathan immediately. He reviewed Hazel's evidence and then made a discovery of his own that shattered Derek's case completely. While researching the legal history of the family's property disputes, Nathan found a document filed 18 years earlier, shortly after Wren's parents died. At that time, Lenora's attorney had contacted Margot regarding the guardianship of 7-year-old Wren. Margot had refused to accept responsibility, but the attorney had required more than a verbal refusal. As a condition of releasing Margot from any potential obligation related to Wren's care and the family's property interests, Margot had been asked to sign a formal disclaimer, a legal document explicitly relinquishing any claim to the family's assets, including the land. The document was clear. The language was specific, and at the bottom was Margot's signature, written in confident, unhesitating handwriting. She had signed it willingly, eagerly, because signing it was the price of walking from a 7-year-old child she did not want. She had traded her niece for her freedom, and in doing so, she had traded every right she would ever have to the land Lenora was protecting. Nathan filed his response to Derek's challenge the next day. The package included 40 years of continuous tax records in Lenora's name. The notarized will naming Lenora as sole heir. 3 letters are from Lenora's former attorney confirming her ownership across multiple decades. Hazel Drummond's sworn statement and video evidence demonstrating Lenora's unimpaired cognitive function within months of her death. and a certified copy of the disclaimer Margot had signed 18 years ago, voluntarily surrendering all claims to family property in exchange for freedom from the responsibility of raising her dead sister's daughter. Cramver. Nathan called Derek directly. Your client signed away her claim 18 years ago, when she signed away a 7-year-old child. This challenge is over. Withdraw it today, or I will file for sanctions and recovery of every legal fee my client has incurred. I will also provide the court with the disclaimer your client signed, and I will ask the judge to consider whether a challenge brought by someone who voluntarily relinquished their rights represents a good faith use of court resources. 2 days of silence followed. No calls, no emails, no legal filings. Wren spent those 2 days in the shop, unable to work, unable to plan, unable to do anything except wait and check her phone every few minutes for a notification that did not come. She cleaned the same shelf 3 times. She organized the button drawer twice. She walked to the window and looked out at the street so often that she memorized the crack pattern in the sidewalk. Nathan had told her to be patient, that Derek's silence almost certainly meant he was consulting with Margot about whether to continue or withdraw, and that every hour of silence was an hour in their favor. But patience, Wren was discovering, was the most exhausting form of courage. On the 3rd morning, Nathan called. Derek had withdrawn the challenge. The caveat was lifted. The property was free. That same week, Harlan Jessup made one final attempt. He called Wren's phone directly, bypassing Nathan entirely, a move that Nathan would later describe as either desperate or arrogant, and probably both. Harlan's offer had increased to $1.5 million, accompanied by a 48-hour deadline. His voice carried the same polished warmth, but beneath it, Wren could hear something she recognized from every story Lenora had ever told her about people who wanted what did not belong to them. Impatience disguised as generosity. With the legal challenge resolved and the bank deadline approaching, this might be your best option. Harlan said, I am trying to help you, Wren. Wren looked out the shop window at the quiet street, where her grandmother had spent 40 years protecting a secret that Harlan had spent 15 years trying to buy. Did you tell my aunt about the land, Harlan? The pause on the other end lasted just long enough to be an answer. Property transactions generate public interest, Harlan said carefully. Information moves. Wren nodded to herself. Your company tried to buy this land 3 times while my grandmother was alive. She said no every time. She said no when she could barely pay her heating bill. She said no when she was eating canned soup for dinner. She said no when she could have changed her entire life with one signature. Now I am saying no. Harlan's voice cooled, the warmth dropping away like a mask removed at the end of a performance. Your grandmother refused me 3 times. She died in a shop that could not pay its own heating bill. Think about whether you want to follow that path. Wren smiled, though he could not see it. She died owning land worth $3 million. I would say her path worked out fine. She ended the call. Then she sat down in Lenora's chair and for several minutes did nothing at all. The shop was quiet. Late afternoon light fell across the cutting table where the quilt still lay, its patchwork surface glowing with the colors of fabrics Lenora had collected over a lifetime. Nathan had already been working on what came next. With the caveat lifted and the title cleared, he had opened negotiations with a second development company, one that had no connection to Harlan Jessup or Caraway Development. Within 48 hours, they reached an advance agreement, a preliminary payment secured against the upcoming property sale, large enough to cover Wren's bank obligation with room to spare. Nathan wired the payment to the bank on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before the deadline. That evening, Wren opened her banking app for the first time in days. She stared at the screen. No red warnings, no overdue notices, no threatening messages. The balance was modest, but the debt was gone. She lowered the phone slowly and looked around the shop. She expected to feel victorious. She expected relief to arrive like a wave, washing everything clean. Instead, she cried, not because of the money, because fear had lived inside her for so long that its sudden absence felt less like freedom and more like the silence after a storm, a silence so complete that she did not know what to listen for next. She did not yet know what to do with that silence. But she knew, for the first time in months, that she was not going to lose everything, that the shop would still be here tomorrow, that Lenora's quilt would still be resting on the cutting table, that the land her grandmother had protected for 4 decades finally, legally, and irrevocably safe. Wren wiped her eyes and placed the phone on the counter. The bank was paid. The legal challenge was defeated. Harlan's offer was rejected. Margot was gone. The property was secure. Everything that had threatened to destroy her in the past 12 days had been turned back by the evidence assembled by a woman who died 2 years ago and defended by a 19-year-old girl who refused to let go. But the largest question was still unanswered. The final property sale had not yet closed. The full transaction could take weeks or months to complete. And in the silence left behind by the retreating storm, Wren Calloway was beginning to realize that survival was only the first chapter. What she did next, whether she sold everything and walked away or stayed and built something from the ruins, would determine whether Lenora's sacrifice became merely a private fortune or something that lasted long enough to matter. In the days that followed, Wren did something no one expected. She did not call a financial advisor. She did not contact a real estate agent about selling the shop. She did not begin searching for apartments in Seattle, or looking at job listings, or making any of the moves that a 19-year-old girl who had just secured a multi-million-dollar inheritance might reasonably be expected to make. Instead, every morning before sunrise, she unlocked the front door of Lenora's sewing shop, turned on the space heater she had bought to replace the broken furnace, and sat behind the old cutting table with a notebook. She wrote for hours, not letters, not journal entries, plans. She sketched the layout of the shop as it was, then beside it, the shop as it could be. She listed materials, costs, timelines, and names of people she would need to contact. She wrote down ideas that felt too large for a 19-year-old to carry, and then she crossed out the ones that felt too small. Restore the original storefront. Repair the hardwood floors she suspected were hidden beneath decades of cheap linoleum. Keep Lenora's sewing machine in its original place by the window. Open a modern boutique specializing in handcrafted clothing, alterations, and locally made textiles. Offer weekend sewing classes for anyone who wanted to learn. Give older craftspeople a place to teach skills that were disappearing from the world one retirement at a time. Create a space where someone who had lost everything could walk through the door and find something worth starting over for. Wren stared at the pages. For 2 years, she had worked inside a corporate office managing schedules, filing reports, coordinating meetings about meetings, and believing that the skills she was learning belonged to that world and no other. She had believed that losing that job meant those skills had become worthless, like currency from a country that no longer exists. But looking at the notebook, she began to see those skills differently. She knew how to organize, how to plan, how to manage budgets and coordinate people and communicate with professionals twice her age. She had learned those things in a glass tower in Seattle. But the reason she understood what this shop could become had nothing to do with corporate training. That understanding came from 12 years of watching Lenora Calloway sew broken things back together and make them stronger than they were before. The corporate world had given her tools. Lenora had given her a purpose. And for the first time, Wren realized those two things might fit together in a way neither world would have imagined on its own. A knock on the front door interrupted her. Wren opened it to find a young man standing on the sidewalk holding a tape measure and a worn canvas tool bag. He was in his early 20s, broad-shouldered with sawdust on his boots and the kind of sunburn that comes from working outdoors in every season. His name was Colby Winslow. He was a carpenter raised in the same town, and he had come to give Wren an estimate on the repairs Grace had sent him. Colby walked through the shop slowly, examining the walls, the ceiling, the window frames, and the electrical panel with the careful attention of someone who understood old buildings the way Lenora had understood old fabric. Not as things to replace, but as things worth restoring if you knew where to look. He ran his hand along a doorframe and nodded. He tapped a wall and listened to the sound it made. He checked the roof beams by standing on a chair and pressing upward with both palms, testing for give. When he found a water stain near the back corner, he did not shake his head the way the real estate agent had. He said, "That is repairable. Good bones underneath." He stopped near the center of the main room and looked down at the floor. Then he knelt, pulled a utility knife from his belt, and cut a small square from the corner of the faded linoleum that had covered the floor for as long as Wren could remember. The linoleum peeled back with a dry, cracking sound, like old tape being removed from a package. Beneath it was wood, dark, tight-grained, and polished smooth by a century of footsteps. The grain ran in long, straight lines across the plank, and where the linoleum had protected it from light, the color press was a deep, rich amber that seemed to glow from within. Colby looked up at Wren with an expression that was half disbelief and half admiration. This is original white oak, probably 100 years old. Solid planks, not laminate, not veneer. Each one cut from a single piece of timber. You could sand this down and it would look like it was laid yesterday. He ran his fingers across the exposed surface. Your grandmother was standing on a fortune and never ripped it up. Wren almost laughed. That sounds exactly like her. Hiding valuable things beneath ordinary surfaces was apparently a family tradition. Cole became the first person outside of Nathan and Grace who understood what Wren was trying to build. He quoted the repair work at a fair price, connected her with a roofer and an electrician he trusted, and began showing up most mornings before Wren had finished her first cup of tea. He did not ask about the inheritance or the legal battle or how a 19-year-old had ended up in charge of a property worth millions. He simply worked. He measured and sawed and hammered and sanded. And when he took breaks, he sat on the front step, drinking coffee from a thermos and looking at the street with the quiet satisfaction of a person who builds things for a living and recognizes when a building deserves to stand for another 100 years. In the quiet rhythm of his work, Wren found something she had not felt since childhood, the steady comfort of someone building something nearby. Not for her, not because of her, simply alongside her. 3 weeks after Derek withdrew his legal challenge, Margot returned. She came alone this time. No Derek, no briefcase, no legal threats. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when the shop was empty except for Wren, who was sitting behind the cutting table, teaching herself to thread Lenora's sewing machine for the fourth time that day. The thread kept catching on the tension disc, and she was whispering words her grandmother would not have approved of when the brass bell rang. Wren looked up. Margot stood in the doorway wearing a plain coat, no makeup. Her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than Wren remembered. She did not enter immediately. She stood at the threshold and looked around the shop as though seeing it for the first time, which, in many ways, she was. The restored windows let in afternoon light that made the old wood glow. The shelves had been cleaned and reorganized. Colby's tools were stacked neatly in the corner. The shop no longer looked abandoned. It looked like a place in the middle of becoming something. Wren did not speak. She waited. She had learned from watching Lenora that silence, properly applied, was the most powerful fabric in any conversation. The person who spoke first usually revealed more than they intended. Margot walked slowly to the chair across from the cutting table and sat down. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The sewing machine sat between them like a witness. Then Margot spoke, and her voice was different from every previous conversation. Lower, slower, without the polished edges of someone performing confidence. "Your mother begged me to take you. I want you to know that." Wren's hands stopped moving on the machine. She looked at her aunt and felt something shift inside her chest. A wall she had built, at 7 years old, suddenly pressed from the other side by a force she had not anticipated. Margot continued, her voice unsteady now. "Before the accident, your mother was already sick. She had been sick for a long time. The doctors told her she might not have more than a year. She knew before the accident that time was running out. She called me late one night, about 3 weeks before the accident, and she asked me to promise that if anything happened, I would raise you. I would take you into my home and love you and make sure you grew up knowing who she was. I promised her I would. Then she died, and I looked at you and I saw her face in yours, and it broke something inside me that I did not know how to fix. So instead of keeping my promise, I ran from it. and I have carried that with me every day since. Wren's throat tightened until she could barely breathe. She had always believed her parents died suddenly, without warning, without time to prepare. The idea that her mother had known, had planned, had called her sister, and begged for a promise that was never kept, opened a door in Wren's understanding of her own life that she was not prepared to walk through. Everything she had believed about how she became an orphan had just shifted, not in its facts but in its meaning. Her mother had not simply died. She had tried to arrange a future for her daughter, and that future had been broken by the one person she had trusted to hold it. Margot's eyes were wet. I am not here for the money, Wren. I know you do not believe that, and I do not blame you. I have given you no reason to believe anything I say. But I owed your mother the truth, and I have waited too long to say it. Wren sat very still for a long time. She needed time to process what she had heard, and she knew better than to make important decisions while her chest was burning and her eyes were filling and the room seemed to tilt around her. I need to verify what you have told me, she said quietly. Margot nodded. The next day, Wren drove to Grace Pemberton's house. She sat in Grace's kitchen with a cup of tea she did not drink and asked directly whether Grace knew anything about Wren's mother being sick before the accident. Grace was quiet for a long time. She looked at her hands, then at the window, then at Wren. Then she confirmed it. Your mother had been ill for several months before the accident. Lenora knew. She carried that knowledge alone for years afterward. She did not tell you because you were too young to carry that weight, and she wanted your memories of your mother to be whole, not overshadowed by illness and fear. She wanted you to remember your mother laughing, not dying. Grace paused and looked at Wren with an expression that held both tenderness and something harder, something forged in the same fire that had made Lenora who she was. But Margot still broke her promise. Knowing why she failed does not undo the fact that Lenora spent 12 years doing what Margot would not. Your grandmother raised you, fed you, taught you, protected that land. Did everything alone while your aunt lived comfortably and pretended you did not exist. Margot may feel guilty, and that guilt may be real, but guilt is not the same as a claim, and grief is not the same as a right. Wren returned to the shop that evening and called Margot. She asked her to come back the following afternoon. Margot arrived at 3 o'clock. She sat in the same chair, in the same plain coat, and Wren noticed for the first time that her aunt's hands were trembling slightly. Not from cold, from the particular kind of fear that comes when a person knows they are about to hear something final, something that cannot be revised or appealed or taken back. Wren had spent the previous night preparing for this conversation. She had sat at Lenora's kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about what she wanted to say, not in anger, not in retaliation, but with the kind of precision her grandmother brought to every important stitch. She had written notes and crossed them out. She had practiced sentences aloud in the empty apartment and listened to how they sounded in the silence. And she had asked herself a question that she knew would determine not just what she said to Margot, but who she would become after Margot left. What would Lenora say? Wren spoke carefully. She did not raise her voice. She did not harden her face. She spoke the way Grace had told her Lenora used to speak when something mattered too much for anger, with a steadiness that came not from coldness, but from the knowledge that the words needed to arrive without distortion. I believe you loved my mother. I believe you feel guilty about what happened. And I believe that guilt is real. But Grandma Lenora spent 12 years raising me and 40 years protecting this land. She ate canned soup for dinner so she could pay the taxes. She wore the same cardigan for 6 winters so she could keep the filing fees current. She turned down offers that would have changed her life because she believed that someday this land would matter to someone who needed it. And she was right. Wren paused. She let the silence hold for a moment before continuing. You spent 12 years pretending I did not exist. You signed a document giving up your rights to this family's property because it was the price of walking away from a child you did not want. I am not punishing you, Margot, but I am not sharing what she built. Margot did not argue. She did not threaten. She did not cry. She sat in silence for several seconds, looking at the sewing machine. at the quilt still resting on the cutting table, at the restored windows through which afternoon light now poured in a way that made the old shop look almost new. Then she said something that Wren did not expect. "You sound exactly like her." Wren's eyes burned. "I hope so." Margot stood slowly. She straightened her coat the way of a soldier's straightens a uniform before leaving a room for the last time. She looked at Wren one more time and said, "Take care of yourself, Wren." Then she walked out through the front door, and the brass bell rang once behind her, and Wren understood that this was the last time. Margot would not return. The war that Lenora had warned about was over. Wren locked the door. She turned the deadbolt slowly and heard it click into place with a sound that felt final in a way that had nothing to do with locks. She stood at the door for a long moment with her hands still on the bolt, watching through the glass as Margot's figure grew smaller on the sidewalk and then turned a corner and disappeared. Wren waited. She waited for the anger to come, or the satisfaction, or the righteous certainty that she had done the correct thing. None of those arrived. Instead, she felt something she had not anticipated. A hollowness that settled into her chest like cold air, filling a room after someone opens a window in winter. She walked back to the cutting table and sat down. The shop was completely silent. No footsteps on the sidewalk, no cars on the street, no wind pressing against the windows. Just silence and the enormous emptiness of being at 19 years old, completely alone in the world. Her parents were dead. Lenora was gone. And now she had sent away the last person who shared her blood, the last living connection to her mother's face, her mother's voice, her mother's laugh. Wren pressed her palms flat against the table and felt something open inside her chest that she had been holding shut for 12 years. She cried. Not for Margot, not for the money, not for the land or the shop or the legal battle she had won. She cried for the simple, terrible fact that there was no one left. No one whose eyes she could look into and see a trace of her mother's face. No one who could tell her stories about the family she came from. No one who was required by blood to care whether she woke up tomorrow. She did not hear Grace come in. The older woman must have seen Margot leave and waited a few minutes before entering through the back door the way she always did, quietly, without ceremony. Grace sat down beside Wren without saying a word. She placed one hand on the table next to Wren's and let the silence hold them both. She did not try to fix anything. She did not offer advice or reassure or any of the comfortable phrases people use when they want to help but do not know how. She simply sat, and her presence said everything her words did not. After a long time, Grace spoke. "Your grandmother chose you. Hazel chose to come here. Colby chose to help rebuild this place. I chose to walk through that door the first time, and I have chosen to come back every time since. Family is not only the people who share your blood, Wren. Sometimes it is the people who show up." Wren looked around the shop. At the restored windows Colby had reframed with his own hands. At the cutting table where Grace had sat with her so many afternoons. At the sewing machine where Hazel had patiently shown her how to adjust the bobbin tension until the thread ran smooth. At the quilt her grandmother had made, holding a secret meant for someone who had not yet been born when the first stitch was sewn. These people had chosen to be here, not because of obligation, not because of inheritance, not because a blood test or a legal document required them to care, because something in this place, something Lenora had built with decades of patience and sacrifice, had drawn them in and given them a reason to stay. Wren wiped her face with her sleeve. She nodded slowly, and she understood something that would take most people a lifetime to learn. The loneliest moment of her life had just revealed the truth about her family. They were not gone. They were right here. They had simply arrived in a form she had not expected. 2 weeks later, Nathan called with the news Wren had been waiting for. The final property agreement was complete. The title was cleared. The transaction was finalized. A development company, one with no connection to Harlan Jessup or Caraway, had purchased the majority of the property while preserving a small family interest in the surrounding project. After expenses, legal fees, and tax obligations, Wren would receive enough money to secure her future for years to come. She received the news standing behind the counter of the shop, where she had been folding a stack of hand-sewn dishcloths that Hazel had made as samples for the boutique. "We made it, Grandma," Wren whispered. She touched the glass case near the entrance, where the unfinished quilt now rested behind a clean pane. Then she laughed, and then she cried, because the distance between sorting old buttons for 50 cents and holding a document worth millions was so vast that her mind could not cross it without breaking open somewhere in the middle. Nathan also delivered a second piece of news. Caraway Development Group was under investigation by the State Real Estate Regulatory Board. Several property owners in the district had come forward with complaints about high-pressure tactics, below-market offers timed to coincide with fabricated legal disputes, and undisclosed conflicts of interest. One elderly couple had been pressured into selling their property for a third of its value after a mysterious zoning challenge appeared. In the same week, Caraway made an offer. A retired teacher had sold her family's lot after receiving threatening letters about unpaid assessments that turned out to be fraudulent. The pattern matched exactly what Harlan had attempted with Wren, using Margot's challenge to create urgency, then arriving with an offer designed to exploit desperation. Caraway's development license in the area had been suspended pending review. 2 senior executives had been deposed. Financial records had been subpoenaed. Harlan Jessup would not be building anything on that corridor for a very long time. The man who had told Wren that her grandmother died in a shop that could not pay its own heating bill was now watching his own empire develop cracks in its foundation. Lenora, Wren thought, would have appreciated the symmetry. A few days later, Wren received a phone call from an unexpected source, Derek Savalopol. She almost did not answer. She stared at his name on her screen for 3 full rings, remembering the man who had photographed her documents while his mother distracted her, the man who had filed a competency challenge against a dead woman he had never met, the man who had set his briefcase on her cutting table as though he already owned it. But something made her pick up. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps the recognition that unfinished conversations have a way of returning at inconvenient times, and that it was better to hear what he had to say now than to wonder about it later. His voice was different from the clipped, aggressive tone she remembered from the shop. Quieter, stripped of performance. The suit and the briefcase were gone from his voice, and what remained sounded like a man who was tired of pretending. He told Wren that Margot had pressured him into filing the legal challenge despite his own reservations about its merits. He said Harlan had promised to cover all legal fees if Derek succeeded in delaying the property sale long enough for Caraway to negotiate a purchase, an arrangement that the State Bar Association was now investigating as a potential ethical violation. Derek did not apologize. Wren did not expect him to, but he said one thing that stayed with her long after the call ended. "For what it is worth, your grandmother was smarter than all of us." Wren paused. Then she said, "I know." The shop reopened on a Saturday morning in early spring. The air outside had softened, and the street smelled of salt water and fresh rain, and the first blooming flowers in the window boxes of neighboring buildings. Wren had spent weeks preparing. Colby had restored the original hardwood floors, sanding and sealing the century-old white oak until it glowed like honey in the morning light. New lighting replaced the dead fluorescent fixtures. The shelves were cleaned, repaired, and filled with handcrafted clothing, locally made textiles, and bolts of fabric in colors so vivid they seemed to glow against the old wood. Lenora's sewing machine sat in its original position by the window, cleaned and oiled and threaded with fresh cotton, ready to work again after 2 years of silence. When Wren turned it on for the first time that morning, the familiar clatter of the needle filled the room like a voice returning home. Above the entrance, the sign had been restored. The original words were still visible beneath a fresh coat of protective finish. Lenora's alterations and sewing. The letters her grandmother had painted by hand decades ago, standing on a stepladder in the early morning, before the shop opened, were still there beneath the new varnish, their original blue deepened and protected but not replaced. Below them, a new line had been added in the same style, painted by a local sign maker named Everett, who had known Lenora for decades, and who had refused to accept payment for the work. He said Lenora had repaired his dress uniform before his daughter's wedding in 2004 and charged him nothing, and that he had been waiting 20 years to return the favor. Lenora and Wren, threads of home. Wren had considered replacing the old name entirely. A new shop deserved a new identity, she had told herself during one of those early morning planning sessions. She had sketched out alternative names in her notebook, modern names, clever names, names that sounded like the kind of boutique that would attract young professionals with disposable income. But standing outside on the morning of the reopening, looking up at the letters her grandmother had painted decades ago, she crossed out every alternative and closed the notebook. Moving forward did not require erasing where you came from. The old name and the new one would stand together, the way Lenora and Wren had always stood together, one generation holding the next. The sign told the story of this place more clearly than any marketing strategy ever could. It said, "This shop was built by someone, and it is being continued by someone who remembers." Near the entrance, the unfinished quilt rested behind glass in a display case Colby had built from reclaimed oak taken from the shop's original shelving. Beside it, Wren had placed a small handwritten card. No mention of the hidden deed, no mention of the millions, no mention of the legal battle or the developer or the aunt who had tried to claim what she had signed away. Only Lenora's words, "What survives is not always what people can see." Customers arrived throughout the day. Some came because they remembered Lenora, an older man who said she had repaired his father's overcoat in 1987 and that his father had worn it every winter until the day he died. A woman who remembered bringing in a christening gown that had been in her family for 3 generations and who now wanted to know whether Wren could repair a torn seam in the same garment so her own granddaughter could wear it. A retired fisherman who stood in the doorway for a full minute without speaking, then said quietly that this shop used to be the only place in town where a man could bring in a torn coat and not feel ashamed about it. Others came because they had heard about the restored shop from Grace or Hazel or Colby or the local newspaper that had run a small article about the reopening. A woman from the next town over drove 40 minutes because she had heard that someone was teaching sewing classes, and she wanted to learn how to alter her own clothes instead of paying a department store to do it badly. A college student came in asking whether Wren needed part-time help. And when Wren said she was not hiring yet, the student asked whether she could volunteer in exchange for learning how to use the sewing machine. And some simply wandered in off the street, drawn by the warm light and the sound of a sewing machine running near the window. The way people are drawn to any place that feels alive when the world around it feels uncertain. Wren greeted every one of them. She wrote their names in the notebook. She listened to their stories. And by the end of the day, she understood something about this shop that she had not understood before. It was never really about sewing. It was about the door. It was about the fact that the door was open, and that anyone who walked through it would be received without judgment, without qualification, without the need to explain why they were there. That same week, she established a community program through the shop. She called it the Lenora Project. Older craftspeople would teach sewing, tailoring, embroidery, and textile repair to anyone who wanted to learn. Classes would be free for people facing financial hardship. Women who had recently lost their jobs could learn practical skills in a place where no one would judge them for starting over. Retired seamstresses could earn income by teaching. And young people who felt directionless could discover that creating something with their own hands still carried meaning in a world that moved faster every year. Wren funded the program with a portion of the property proceeds, setting up an account that would sustain it long after the initial excitement faded. She knew exactly who this program was for. It was for every version of herself. The 7-year-old who needed someone to say, "You are coming home with me." The 17-year-old who locked a shop door and walked away because she did not know how to carry what it represented. The 19-year-old who stood in the rain outside a corporate building clutching a cardboard box and believed her life was over. And the next person who would walk through that door carrying the same look in their eyes that Wren had carried the night she returned. To this shop, the look of someone who had run out of options and could not imagine what came next. 2 weeks after the reopening, Wren's former colleague from the Seattle office called. His name was Ryan, and he sounded genuinely excited. There was a new position open at the company, Senior Administrative Coordinator. Better salary than before. Better benefits, better title. He had mentioned Wren's name to the hiring manager, and they were interested. Wren listened. She looked around the shop while Ryan described the role and the salary and the growth potential, and all the things that would have made her heart race 6 months earlier. Hazel was sitting near the back, teaching a college student how to repair a torn jacket sleeve using a technique Lenora had perfected over decades. Grace was helping a young mother select fabric for a set of curtains she wanted to make herself, showing her how to feel the weight of the cloth and hold it up to the light to check its weave. Colby was outside replacing a section of the wooden window frame that had started to rot, his hammer keeping a steady rhythm that had become as familiar to Wren as the sound of the sewing machine. Sunlight poured through the restored glass and fell across the cutting table where the quilt had rested on the day Wren's life changed. "Thank you," she said, "but I am not coming back." Ryan paused for a long time. She could hear the confusion in his silence, the sound of someone trying to rearrange their understanding of another person in real time. "You are turning down a coordinator position? For a sewing shop?" 6 months ago, that question would have embarrassed her. She would have heard judgment in it, condescension, the implication that a sewing shop was beneath someone with corporate experience. But standing in the warm light of Lenora's restored storefront, listening to the sewing machine hum and watching Hazel's patient hands guide a young student through her first repair, Wren heard the question differently. She heard it as the question of someone who had never found anything worth more than a paycheck. And she felt, for the first time, not superior to that person, but simply grateful that she was no longer one of them. "I think I finally stopped measuring my life by my job title," she said. After the call, Wren walked to the old cutting table. She opened the leather-bound notebook she had found weeks earlier, the one filled with Lenora's handwriting and customer names and notes about garments and payments and acts of quiet generosity that no one had ever noticed or recorded or remembered, except in the lives they had changed. She turned past the last entry in Lenora's hand, a note about repairing a winter jacket for a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, no charge, husband in hospital. Then she turned to the first blank page. The paper was slightly yellow and smelled faintly of lavender, as though Lenora's hand cream had seeped into the pages over decades of use. Wren picked up a pen. She held it above the paper for a moment, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. Then, she wrote the first entry under her own name, in the same careful handwriting Lenora had used, beginning a new chapter in a book that had never truly ended. The notebook did not belong to the past. It belonged to whoever was willing to continue it. Late that afternoon, after the last customer had gone, and Grace and Hazel had said their goodbyes, and Colby had packed his tools and driven away, Wren stood alone in the center of the shop. The light had turned golden, the way it does in coastal towns when the sun drops toward the ocean and everything seems to slow down and breathe. She looked at Lenora's sewing machine, still warm from the work it had done that day. Then at the quilt behind glass, its patchwork surface glowing with colors that seemed deeper now than they had when Wren first pulled it from beneath a pile of old curtains in a dark storage room. Then at the name above the door, Lenora and Wren, threads of home. Her grandmother had spent a lifetime joining broken pieces together. Fabric, families, futures. She had taken scraps that others discarded and stitched them into something whole. She had taken a 7-year-old girl that no one wanted and given her a home and a history and the knowledge that she was loved. And somewhere in the process, she had joined Wren to a life that Wren had never imagined for herself. Not a corporate life measured in promotions and paychecks and the approval of people whose names she could barely remember. Something harder and stranger and infinitely more valuable. A life built on the belief that what you create with your own hands, what you protect through your own sacrifice, what you give to the people who come after you, is the only wealth that truly survives. Wren walked toward the front door and turned the sign from open to closed. Then she stopped. Through the glass, she saw someone standing on the sidewalk. A young woman. Wren could not tell her age exactly, but she was young, perhaps 19 or 20. Her eyes were red. Her shoulders were pulled inward the way a person's shoulders pull when they are trying to make themselves smaller, as though becoming invisible might somehow protect them from what was happening to their life. In one hand, she held a folded resume. In the other, a piece of paper that looked like it might be a notice of some kind. An overdue bill, a termination letter, an eviction warning, something official that carried bad news and did not care how it was received. Wren recognized that expression. She had worn it herself on a cold November morning in Seattle. Standing in the rain outside a glass building, clutching a cardboard box and calculating how many weeks she had before everything disappeared. She knew exactly what that expression meant. It meant this girl had reached the moment when there seemed to be nothing left. The moment when every door felt closed and every option felt exhausted, and the future looked like a wall with no handholds. Wren unlocked the door. The young woman looked startled. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I know you are closed." Wren looked at her for a long moment. She saw the red eyes, the resume clutched like a lifeline, the paper held in the other hand like a wound. She saw herself standing in a doorway, waiting for someone to say the words that Lenora had said to her when she was 7 years old and the world had taken everything. Then she smiled. "Not for you." She opened the door wider. "Come in." The little brass bell above the doorframe rang once, clean and clear, the way it had rung on the afternoon, when a 63-year-old woman knelt in front of a sessual reservoir and said 5 words that changed the course of a life. "You are coming home with me." And as the sound faded into the quiet of the evening, Wren Calloway finally understood why her grandmother had spent a lifetime protecting a secret sewn inside an unfinished quilt. Why she had refused every offer. Why she had eaten canned soup and worn the same cardigan and paid the taxes year after year and told no one. Why she had hidden a deed worth millions inside a piece of unfinished patchwork and written 4 words on the outside of a letter. For the one who needs it. Because some gifts are never meant to stop with the person who receives them. They are meant to be passed forward. Through the hands of a woman who sewed broken things back together. Through the walls of a shop that refused to disappear. Through the pages of a notebook filled with the names of people who needed help and received it without being asked to explain why. And through a door that opened one more time on a quiet evening for a stranger who needed exactly what Lenora Calloway had always believed this place could give. Not money, not fabric, not even shelter. Simply the knowledge that someone was willing to say, "You are not alone. Come in. There is room for you here."